absolutely not. I mean, it would be a huge tragedy if it were. I think the leadership in both sides understands that that's not in either side's interest. We're not headed to a new Cold War. But there are forces within each country that see each other as a threat and maybe an enemy and want to push towards more harsh and tough policies. And I think that's dangerous. I think within China there's a lot of increasing support, or should we say influence of the security services, the military and government policy, and that doesn't necessarily lead in the right direction. All this came out really starting in 2008 with the Olympics. Their concerns about security in Tibet and Xinjiang are real concerns. They don't know how to handle these problems. China is still in a kind of nation building period. Hasn't consolidated its territory and sovereignty as it keeps talking about. That's why it talks about it so much. The Chinese talk about building harmonious society. You don't talk about building a harmonious society unless it's not harmonious. That's your problem. It isn't harmonious, and we see that. And they don't know what to do. So when they look at their problems, this is what Chinese will tell you. Look, we have our core interests on sovereignty and territorial integrity, which of course includes Taiwan and Tibet issues. And you're not helping us on those issues. You're making it worse for us from their perspective. And yet you want us to work with you on your core interest or on global issues. You know, why should we do that when you're not helping us? In fact, you're hurting us on our trying to deal with our internal problems. And that's a perspective. Obviously we don't see it the same way, that we're trying to harm them. Certainly the United States supports China's territorial integrity and sees Tibet as part of China. It supports greater autonomy, but then the United States would argue that the things we support are good for China and for its development and its harmonious society. So we disagree on a lot of these things, but Chinese have a different point of view on this, and it's important to try to understand how they perceive these issues and what their interests are at stake, and find ways to not let the differences get out of hand and try to narrow them by trying to understand each other and where we're really coming from. Because there are people in China who would think that our Taiwan arms sales is part of a plot to keep Taiwan separate permanently from the mainland, or support of the Dalai Lama as a cultural and religious figure. Meeting him is somehow support for Taiwan independence. Well, that's not really true, but that's how it's perceived, and I think we have to understand that's how it's perceived. And they perceive a lot of things about us that aren't true, and we often perceive things about them that are really wrong. We don't get it right. So we have to be very careful and not demonize each other and not let the perceptions run too far along the course where the narrative becomes we're on a path to a Cold War. I really don't think that's right. Now, I do think if you start treating the other side as an enemy, it will become one. I mean, you can make very bad decisions and get where you don't want to go. But I don't think from a strategic perspective it's in either country's interest or likely to happen unless very bad decisions are made for us to be at odds with each other systematically. And I think actually our future is how can we cooperate? The great strategic challenges of our time will not be dealt with in any effective way if the US and China can't cooperate on them. It's just impossible. China is the second most important country in the world, second largest economy. It's a quarter of the world's population, approximately maybe 20%. We have to work together with them, and we have to find how to do it. And they need to work with us, because we're share a common fate on these larger issues. And I think we will, but I think it's going to be a rocky road getting there. And the internal forces in each country make it very difficult for leaders who often see this need to work together, but face a lot of opposition internally to pulling it off. And protectionism is an example where an interest group within the country, like the United States, they're actually hurt. They are hurt, certain groups, by the trade with China, whatever it might be. So they want to impose protectionist measures to protect their own interests. That's understandable. But from a broader national interest, it may actually weaken our economy, be a negative impact on our economic development, on our prosperity of our people, and really lead to trade wars and an overall diminishing of global trade and success. So leaders have to look at the bigger picture and the longer term interests of the whole country, not any one particular interest group. And I'm afraid China is in a period where I think a lot of the interest groups in China have a lot of clout with the government. And we have the same problem here, that they can block the president from doing things that the president knows are necessary for the United States, but they're uncomfortable. And so I think climate change is an example where you have to spend a lot of money now to deal with problems that the payoff, that is what you're going to avoid in a worse situation, is maybe 10 or 20 years in the future. And you're trying to tell people you have to make a sacrifice now to prevent a much worse situation developing 20 years from now. And that's a hard sell. And yet people tried to do it at Copenhagen. In fact, both countries really do want to move forward in clean technology, clean energy technology, do recognize it's a problem, but it's hard to sell it in Congress. And a lot of people's interests may be hurt in the short term by a cap and trade system, for example. So those people are going to complain and try to prevent it from happening. And this is a global phenomenon. Look at the EU, the European Union now. It really has trouble trying to figure out how to cooperate, and now they got countries that are in big financial difficulties, and should they be bailed out? I'll give you an example. In Greece, part of the crisis is the Greeks want to lower the retirement age from 63 to 61, so pensions are paid at 61. The Germans are raising their retirement from 65 to 67. The Germans want to subsidize the Greeks getting a 61-year-old age for retirement when they're working until they're 67, and they're paying the difference. That kind of struggle is going on all over the world on so many issues, and it makes it very difficult for countries to cooperate with other countries on what they can understand to be common interests, because it involves sacrifice of some people's interests. Even in the long run, the outcome is better for all concerned.